Shackelford.
And I'm Edidiong Obot.
And this is
Fresh Perspective.
This is our show where we talk about politics, the civic space, community, and us all come together as one across the diaspora. And on our last episode, we were talking about the state of Black America, part 2, and we were closing out a conversation on social justice, which led or leads into our conversation today on race and justice. So recently, The Atlantic, a national publication, had an event here in Houston, or a conference, if you will, focused on race and justice. And they had all these different individuals in leadership within the Houston community, within the county, within the state of Texas, that have roles and responsibilities that deal with the criminal justice system. And so today we kind of wanted to unpack a lot of what was discussed within that conference and those conversations, but also just talk about race and justice in general, as well as some of our experiences and other things that have been taking place across the country and here in the city of Houston. And so, starting off, let's talk about race and justice. What do those two things mean? And I guess, Diddy, for you, when you think about justice, what does that mean to you?
Well, for me, I think justice is just kind of err on the side of those who are innocent versus those who are guilty, right? And just kind of seeing something that's not supposed to happen being addressed in the proper manner, right? And that can be from an individual standpoint where you're correcting somebody, or like here we're talking about race and justice, because most people associate justice with police or the judges or the court system and things like that, and you see quote unquote justice being served, meaning that a wrong was finally right. So for me, I think that's what justice looks like, in a sense, where you see somebody, we just kind of take a general aspect of this, right? Police officer guns down black or brown teen or adult for whatever reason that may be, right? And maybe it is something that's just very biased. They just, scared, or they claim that they were scared. It was happened to be somebody who's a minority and they shoot them down, and it's kind of like you ask questions later, and then that person kind of goes through their process as the court system has for the police officer, as well as for the victim of the family's victim, the victim's family. In that process, justice kind of gets served where either the police officer is removed or, whatever happens. That's a form of, I guess, justice kind of being served, in a sense. That's just, an overall example, a broad example, but that's kind of like what I think when we're talking about race and justice, that, listen, we're finally addressing something that should have been addressed before, shouldn't have even been a problem. And now that something bad happened, you're correcting it by serving justice, whether that person gets removed from their position, garnished wages, maybe it's a settlement, whatever that looks like, that can say, hey, there isn't a price for a life, but, we're able to at least address why this even happened in the first place.
Yeah, and I feel like justice, when you hear that term, for a lot of us, we automatically think about the criminal justice system.
Right.
And so for me, I think it's really just as simple as getting it right.
Right.
And so if a crime is committed, if something is done, making sure that whatever the outcome is, it's grounded in the right thing. So not taking into account all these different implicit bias that often we may or may not be aware of, but really just taking as much emotion out of it as possible, looking at the situation, and this is what should be done. Just really doing the right thing. Now, obviously, you can't do that. We're not robots. And even with that, there's a certain level of context that has to be taken into consideration with every situation. And I feel like that's probably my frustration, and a lot of people's frustration when you start talking about the law, is because it should be one or the other, but what we find in the data is that it's skewed considerably based on, a lot of times, the complexion of one's skin.
Right.
And so you find that two people could be the exact same crime committed, but the sentences are starkly different that are handed out. And so when you start getting into justice, that's not justice.
Right.
Because if it's good enough for this person, why is the sentence different over here? And so I think making sure that those decisions that are being handed out are equitable, regardless of what background or what community someone comes from, they're able to get a fair decision. That's justice. The race component, I feel like, is layered because obviously you have the human race.
Right.
I think that's the goal. Ultimately, is for us to all look at it from that spectrum.
Yeah.
We're all one. We're all one human race. And if we were able to actually act under that context, I feel like we would be in a much better situation.
Right.
But the reality, unfortunately, is that's not how things operate.
Right.
We've gotten to a point now where, especially in our country, it's extremely divisive, especially under this current administration, our current president. And as a result, everything is just very, very polarized. It's like you're either pro-black, if you're pro-black, you're anti-police, and it's like, that's not the same thing.
Right.
You can be pro-black and still be for the police officer that are actually out there doing their job, doing the right thing. And so race, I feel like, is something that in this country we've never really addressed. We were kind of born out of some very complicated things, to say the least. At the end of the day, you had people that were torn from their families, brought to America, enslaved, and used to build this country to where it is. But me saying something as simple as that, a lot of people don't want to hear that. They don't want to address that. They don't want to acknowledge it. They'll be quick to say that happened in the past. Why are you talking about that? But I feel like that's why we're in the place we are in this country today, because people have not addressed it. And so that just kind of sets the table, race and justice. And so there were 8 different panels or conversations that took place during the conference on race and justice. And I know we were very fortunate because we had Sheriff Gonzalez to come out. You had District Attorney Kim Ogg. We had a representative from the police union. You had representatives from Harris County's Precinct 1 office. A lot of very important people, very high up positions, if you will, again, within the city and the county. And so we were able to glean some things from those conversations in terms of their viewpoints. And I know for you, you mentioned some things that Sheriff Gonzalez talked about that definitely resonated with you, or at least stood out, I should say.
Yeah, so a few things, kind of going back to the race. I think for those who are part of the immigrant community, I think it's first understanding America's history as it relates to race, and then understanding where you fit in that piece of history that is still kind of a part of our current history now, right? Because it's easier for somebody who may be African American to kind of make that statement that you made, right? You have families who were ripped apart from slavery. It's not as easy for me to make that kind of statement because from my aspect, my parents are immigrants, so yes, they know of that history, but it's kind of like a disconnect, right? Because they're coming from another country into another country that this was the bread and butter of how they built this country, right? Not saying that didn't happen in Africa. Obviously, slavery didn't happen in Africa, but as far as its direct, lineage, it's hard to say, hey, that slavery occurred probably when my great-great-great-grandparents happened, were alive, as opposed to here in America, that's still a fresh wound. These are, grandparents that are still living now, great-grandparents that are still living now who actually pick cotton, who actually can tell those stories of their families being ripped apart. So I think for the immigrant community, whether you're African, whether you're Hispanic, Asian, whatever it is, understanding that American history, especially from the African American lens, then you can understand how these systematic things keep happening in America, where you're not seeing the progression that we should be seeing over the years to come. I mean, from civil rights to even now, it's like people always compare, like, you know, what are we doing? I don't see any change. And there's been change, but you don't necessarily see it as on that big media forefront as it was in civil rights. So kind of addressing what you were saying about Sheriff Gonzalez, I think for me, being able to hear what he said, one, he comes from an immigrant community. He's been a public servant for a while. He was a former council member for the city, and now he's currently a sheriff. So this is somebody who literally is an agent for change. He literally is saying, hey, I see what is happening. I'm a part of this community, and I want to do something about it. And now I'm at the table to do something about it. This is why your vote is important, right? Because you can vote people who look like you into these positions of decision making, right? So that policies and programs can be changed. For me, things that stood out for Sheriff Gonzalez is that he really is about police reform. So much so that, you know, people get arrested for petty crimes, petty things, you know, whether it's drugs, you know, you have a little bit of marijuana on you, you know, compared to having a whole coke, you know, cocaine, drug lord kind of thing. You shouldn't get the same sentence, right? So what he was saying is that, like, they have, like, these programs now set up in Harris County where they address the sentencing, especially from, you know, those who are teenagers. You know, you kind of you're getting them into a system at a very young age where they probably shouldn't even be there. They probably should be with a mentor or somebody that can address, you know, juveniles who are acting out. And it kind of goes back to that root stem of why are they acting out? What is going on in their household, or what is going on with that current teenager or that adult that is causing them to either act out or to commit the crime? Because, I mean, people are out here struggling. You know, maybe you need food. Maybe, you know, you just kind of like down on your luck and you just, you know, you don't know what to do. Maybe you're depressed. Maybe it's whatever. And so with Sheriff Gonzalez, he was saying that they're really addressing that from a mental health standpoint, really assessing, like, when they arrest whoever it is, trying to really streamline that assessment to see what program they should probably go into. Is it a drug rehabilitation program? Is it a mental health, you know, facility where you're actually addressing anxiety, depression, dementia? You know, is it something that, you know, maybe it's a job recovery program where you lost your job and you just, you know, you need some kind of income? Really kind of assessing what's going on that's causing people to maybe commit a crime of that nature. So for me, like I said, it's good to see somebody who represents an immigrant community, who's also in law enforcement, who is aware and can speak to, you know, issues that are going on, not only from the immigrant community, but from just the overall Houston community. And then also now say, hey, these are some of the things that we need to change in our policing, you know, having more of that community conversation as opposed to just having just leadership making decisions.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things is currently within the county and the city, we're in a position where we have some very good leadership. You have individuals like Sheriff Gonzalez, you have people like District Attorney Kim Ogg, who has been at the forefront of what you call a diversion program. So focusing on things like marijuana, making it to where now they have a diversion program in place where if you have, you know, less than X quantity, you don't necessarily go to jail.
Right.
Now you have the ability to go take a class and then pay the fee and it's removed. And it's been very successful in terms of their first couple, we'll say, years and change in terms of trying to get that rolled out. And because leadership is on the same page, there really is a focus right now on trying to not put people in jail for these non-violent offenses.
Right.
And definitely when you're talking about trace amounts of marijuana, and it's kind of rolling back what was started with the war on drugs.
Right.
And those are some things that were rolled out when we were probably a little bit before we were born and when we were growing up.
Right.
And really tore apart our communities. And so it's something that we're seeing move in a positive direction. We definitely make sure we take advantage of that while we have these types of people in office,
Right.
to get a lot more out of it for our communities. And I definitely want to dig into that deeper as soon as we get back from this break.
And we're back. My name is Edidiong Obot, and I'm with my co-host Ray Shackelford, and we are talking about race and justice this episode. So, in the first segment, we were kind of talking about the overall picture of what race looks like, what justice looks like to us, comments that Sheriff Gonzalez made, and just kind of talking about the different programs that Houston in particular are taking to address police reform and just kind of criminal justice and that social justice aspect. So in this next segment, I think we should really kind of touch on some of the other resources that are available to us in regards to police reform. There are some grassroots organizations that are tackling that. There are some nonprofits that are tackling that. Like, for instance, we talked about Black Lives Matter, and they're really on the forefront of kind of bringing about awareness. That may be through protesting, that may be through actually having forums and conversations between police officers and activists, and just kind of figuring out what's the best way to communicate. On that specific forum from the Atlantic that they had this program, one of the panelists talked about how in the next few years is going to be a class that everybody might have to take in regards to how to communicate with the community and the police officers, whether you're coming from the community like us or you're coming from a policing standpoint, and have that common conversation with each other before it escalates to an arrest or it escalates to, God forbid, death. But just having that simple class on how to just relate with each other, which I find that, like, the basic, right? Like, I feel like you should know how to talk to somebody, but, you enter into these jobs with different biases, and not everybody is biased, right? Not everybody has that, but in a sense, even from a community standpoint, where the police were seen as our protectors, and they still are our protectors, some are very scared to even engage with them. Some people may even tense up when they get stopped. Maybe it may be a traffic ticket, or it may be something else, but you kind of get tense, like what's going on, and you may see something wrong going on in your neighborhood, and you might not be as, I don't know, open, not really say open, but you may not be as, like, comfortable to call the police, because they may check on you, see, well, what are you doing? As opposed to, like, no, this is an active scene happening here, address that, but it's like they want to address everything, and you move from having that idea of a protector of your community to, like, a protector / harasser kind of thing. You're like, So I think that there are some nonprofits, like I said, hashtag Black Lives Matter, even Urban League. There are other nonprofits, grassroots organizations that are trying to address those issues within our own community, even in law enforcement.
Right, and I think that obviously, as you mentioned, we started off talking about the sheriff's office and district attorney's office touching on some of the things they're doing briefly from a criminal justice reform standpoint. Now we're moving into the police department, which is probably a more polarizing, more sensitive area nationwide as a whole. And while there are entities, like you mentioned, as far as the Urban League and other organizations that are trying to bring about reform, whether it's looking more at community policing, and even, I think somebody on the panel you said mentioned having community conversations on both sides in terms of citizens as well as police department. While that needs to happen, the focus should be on the individuals within the police department, because at the end of the day, this is your job.
Right.
You're being paid to protect and serve. And so a lot of the conversation, at least that I've heard at that panel and within at least some individuals, I shouldn't say across the board because I don't want to generalize like that, but there's a lot of talk about we need more police officers, or we have a shortage of police officers when you look at our population versus the officers and try and compare it to other large cities. And my thing is, right now we don't need more police. We need to focus on getting it right with the police that we do have.
Right.
And I will also say that, you know, the majority of police officers I deal with are good police officers. They're doing their job, and that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
We're talking about the individuals that are in the videos, gunning down men of color, the ones that are not in the videos that are being protected by that blue wall. They try to act like it doesn't exist. And essentially when I say the blue wall, what I'm referencing is police officers not holding some of their peers accountable for their actions and making the public aware of what they're doing. And so that does exist, whether or not people want to acknowledge it. Everybody has bias. It's just a matter of whether or not you are aware of them, you acknowledge them, and whether or not you take that into account as you're going about your day-to-day. I have biases. I'm aware of them. I do my best to make sure that when I'm making decisions, that's not coming into play. But anybody who says they don't have them, they're not being honest.
Right.
But you're able to see based on how people live out their lives, how they do their day-to-day, in terms of if they're able to effectively manage those things. And so I think one of the things that came out of that conversation, or should come out of it, is a focus on retraining our officers and really getting at the root of what have they been exposed to. Because you mentioned something about some of them being fearful, and the reality is, you know, if you live in the Katy area, the Cypress area, you may or may not be exposed to African Americans or the immigrant community on a day-to-day basis. And so when you do come into contact with them, you don't know anything about them outside of what you've been exposed to through the media. And depending on what channel you're turned on to, it may not be that positive.
Right.
And so that's definitely something that we have to guard against and work at. And you even saw that, you saw an attempt at trying to address it, and this is going more into a recent story in the news, is with Starbucks. They shut down all their stores to do this training on their employees and making sure that they're aware and sensitive to different things going on in the community. And, you know, I question how effective that is. One day, that's not the answer. This is something that's been done on an ongoing basis, because when you look at it, these types of thought processes have been perpetuated for so long. It's not something that's that simple to overcome. And for me, when you were talking, it made me think about the conversations my father would have me and my brother about being careful about, you know, police interaction. You know, if you get pulled over, you need to do X, Y, Z. Yes, sir. No, sir. Make sure your hands are visible. These are not conversations that our white counterparts are having to have.
Right.
Because they're not afraid of whether or not their kids are going to have a bad interaction with a police officer and not make it home. And those are the conversations that people don't want to have because it focuses more on race than just the justice component.
Right.
They don't want to believe that there is a difference in how they're being treated. But again, when you look at the Oakland situation, and there's been some of the funniest memes I've ever seen that came out of that, but the situation was not fun.
Right.
You had individuals that were trying to barbecue at a park or by a lake in Oakland, and a woman called the police on them
Because she felt threatened?
Allegedly, and she felt like they shouldn't be there. And they literally weren't doing anything. They weren't involved in her, nobody said anything to her. And she called the police. And upon arrival, the police did nothing in this instance because they were doing nothing wrong. I think it also didn't hurt that you had someone that was recording it, which always doesn't necessarily help. But I think in this instance, it did. Yeah. It shone a very bright light on the situation. And in that instance, it had a positive outcome overall. But there's also been, I think it was a comedian, maybe Ryan Davis, joked about maybe we need to start actually charging people who make these calls to the police, because that costs money. That's taxpayer money.
Yeah, when you call 911 false, like, something happens to you. So.
And so you don't want it to get to a point where it serves as a deterrent to people to call the police, but at the end of the day, if you're calling the police for something like, oh, they're at the park, they're barbecuing, and they're literally doing nothing wrong, or they're in a Starbucks, they're having a meeting, and again, they're doing nothing wrong, there should be some type of consequences for them, because one, they were doing nothing wrong.
Right.
And there was a young lady who spoke on a panel. She had a very good quote. It was basically around, just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean it's an emergency, but just because you're fearful doesn't mean it's an emergency.
Right.
Because and the reality is, just because black people or black men make you fearful, that doesn't make it an emergency. They weren't doing anything in either of those examples.
Right.
And so from a societal standpoint, there's a lot of work that has to be done. And I've even experienced it serving on the police board for the city of Houston. And so there's this board where whenever there's a use of force case or officer discharges a weapon, those cases come before a panel of citizens. There's 4 of us, and we rotate from week to week to review these cases to see if there's anything done wrong on the part of the officers, and then make recommendations, whether it's something punitive, some type of training, policy-wise, to the police chief, councilperson over public safety, as well as the mayor. And then they take those recommendations and make some type of decision.
Right.
But I brought that up because some of the individuals who serve on the panel with me perpetuate some of that same thought process. Mm. And so it's been very enlightening. I've done that for about almost 3 years now, where I'm in these rooms and we're looking at tape and we're reviewing a case, and there's clearly an issue, but their automatic response is they should just listen to the officer, or clearly they shouldn't have been doing that. And it's like they're completely oblivious to what's actually taking place, and they automatically go to an excuse in terms of that's just their standard answer, and always defending the officer versus looking at it, again, knowing your biases, looking at it from, objectively, and making the right decision. And that's part of the issue, and that's why we, in a lot of instances, don't get to justice, because people don't acknowledge the issue of race.
So, I find that, that's not something I'm surprised about, but it's an unfortunate situation, right? And when you think about, race and justice, even from, I'll say, a celebrity standpoint, right? Sometimes people feel like celebrities are untouchable. Like, you can just pay the bond or pay whatever it is, and you're done. But I remember there was a few incidents that happened with, NFL players where they were stopped. I believe it was either Martellus or Michael Bennett, one of them. They were at a fight, and I don't know what was going on. Something broke out. Everybody was running, and this specific individual, the NFL player, was running another way. So police officers immediately thought that he was a suspect. Held him down. He couldn't breathe, and all this was recorded. And you look at it and you're like, listen, when it comes to, and it kind of goes back to what you said, retraining officers, because it doesn't matter your status, doesn't matter what it is. There are some police officers who just see your color and automatically kind of just think, fearful, or this person might be dangerous. And kind of do overuse of police force, right? One thing on that panel that that question came about was, what is an example of retraining the police force? What does that look like? I think for me, I think one thing that we can do would be to kind of do an assessment, right, before you get hired on, just to kind of see like what those biases look like for that individual person before they get hired on, and then kind of addressing it like, hey, this is a kind of psychological assessment they need, or mental health assessment that needs to be done before this person gets hired on to the force. I don't know if they do that now, but that might be something where they did do it, maybe taking it to another step with further measures, just to kind of do that retraining. And I mean, obviously, like we said before earlier, there are classes and talking about community interaction and things like that, but I'm thinking even before that, like before you even get hired onto the police force, what kind of person are you hiring to protect and serve the community?
No, absolutely.
And they do those kind of assessments when you enter the military. So why not do the same kind of things when you're about to enter into the police force, when you're working with local citizens? We're not talking about somebody in another country. We're talking about somebody that is in your community.
Right. And it makes a lot of sense. And we're definitely going to get more into that in part 2 of Race and Justice. Make sure you tune in. I'm Ray Shackelford.
And I'm Edidiong Obot.
And this has been
Fresh Perspective.